I always believed I would never see Ben again. For a long time, I thought he had become only a memory. Sometimes I could still hear his laugh in my mind. Sometimes I remembered the silly jokes we shared after school. Those memories never completely disappeared. They simply became quiet as life moved on. Ben and I met when we were 12 years old. He was the new student in our class. On his first day, he looked nervous. He sat alone during lunch, and no one talked to him. I walked over with my tray and asked, "Can I sit here?" He looked surprised, then smiled. "Sure," he said. That simple question started a friendship that lasted through all our teenage years. We went to school together almost every day. We studied for exams. We played basketball in the park until the streetlights came on. Sometimes we bought cheap snacks from the small store near school. We talked about everything. We talked about music, movies, our families, and our dreams. We believed we would grow up together. "I want to travel around the world one day," Ben often said. "Then don't forget to send me postcards," I always replied. He laughed. "I'll send you one from every country." Back then, the future felt easy. We believed good friends would stay together forever. But life had a different plan. One Monday morning, Ben did not come to school. Our teacher told us his family had moved to another city because of his father's new job. Everything happened so fast. There was no chance to say goodbye. No last walk home. No final basketball game. No picture together. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was a short message from Ben. "Take care. I'll never forget you." I read those words again and again. I wanted to reply with something meaningful. Instead, I only typed, "You too, stay safe." That was the last message we ever shared. At first, I waited for another text. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Nothing came. As the years passed, I searched for his name online a few times. I hoped I would find a social media account or an old class photo. Every search ended the same way. Nothing. Slowly, college, work, bills, and daily life filled my calendar. I met new people and built a new life. I told myself I had accepted the past, or maybe I simply learned how to hide it. Then, on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, something happened that I never expected. I walked into a crowded coffee shop, looking for a quiet place to finish my work. I had no idea that, in less than 5 minutes, my past was about to walk back into my life. The coffee shop was louder than usual. People were talking, laptops covered almost every table, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. I looked around for an empty seat and finally found one near the window. I put down my bag and opened my laptop. Just as I started reading an email, I heard the barista call out a name. "Large latte for Ben." My hands stopped moving. Ben. It was a common name. I knew that. Still, something made me look up. A man stood near the counter with his back to me. He wore a dark blue jacket and carried a worn backpack. There was nothing special about him, but something felt familiar. Then he turned around. For a second, the whole room seemed to disappear. It was him. He looked older than I remembered. His face was thinner, and there were a few grey hairs near his ears. Life had clearly been busy with him, but his eyes had not changed. I knew those eyes. He looked across the room. Our eyes met. He frowned for a moment, as if he could not believe what he was seeing. Then his expression softened. "Alex?" he asked quietly. I stood up without thinking. "Ben?" Neither of us moved for a few seconds. Then we both laughed. "I can't believe this," I said. "Neither can I," he replied. We shook hands at first, almost like strangers. Then he smiled. "Come on," he said. "A handshake. After all these years. We hugged, and suddenly the distance of nearly 20 years felt much smaller. "Sit down," I said. "I'd love to." For the next half hour, we talked about simple things. Where we lived, what we did for work, how our parents were doing. He told me he had a daughter who loved drawing. I showed him a picture of my dog that always made my friends laugh. The conversation was easy. It almost felt like we had met only a few weeks ago instead of many years. Still, I could feel something waiting between us. There was an empty space that neither of us wanted to touch. Every time the conversation became quiet, I thought about that last message. "Take care. I'll never forget you." I had so many questions. Where had he been? Why had he never called? Why had he disappeared without a word? I looked at my coffee, then took a slow breath. "I've wanted to ask you something for a very long time," I said. Ben looked at me and nodded. "I know," he answered softly. I looked into his eyes. "Why did you disappear?" His smile faded. He lowered his head and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. After a long silence, he whispered, "The truth is, I wanted to come back. I just didn't know how." Ben did not answer right away. He looked down at the coffee in his hands. The smile on his face slowly disappeared. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the window, people walked past in a hurry. Someone laughed across the room. A phone rang near the counter. Life around us went on as usual, but for us, time seemed to stop. Finally, Ben took a deep breath. "My father didn't move because of a new job," he said softly. I frowned. "Our teacher told us that." "I know," he replied. "My parents wanted people to believe that." I looked at him in silence. The truth was very different. He paused before continuing. "My father lost his job first. A few months later, he became seriously ill. We had almost no money. My mother worked 2 jobs, but it wasn't enough." He gave a small, tired smile. "So we sold our apartment and moved to live with my grandparents." I felt my chest grow heavy. All these years, I had believed he simply left. I had never imagined what his family was going through. "When we moved," Ben continued, "everything changed. I had a new school. I worked every evening at a small grocery store. On weekends, I helped my grandfather fix old bicycles. I wasn't thinking about parties or basketball anymore. I was only thinking about how to help my family." He looked out the window. "I wanted to call you many times." "So, why didn't you?" I asked quietly. Ben laughed, but it was a sad laugh. "The first year I was too busy. The second year I thought it was already too late. The third year I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" He looked into my eyes. "I thought you would hate me." His words stayed in the air between us. "I imagined you asking why I disappeared. I imagined you telling me I wasn't your friend anymore. So every year, calling became harder." I slowly nodded. The strange thing was, I had imagined almost the same conversation. Many times I wanted to search for him again. Many times I started writing a message. But then I stopped. I thought, if he wanted to find me, he would. Neither of us knew the other person was thinking the same thing. One misunderstanding became 2. 2 became 10 years, then 20. "It's funny," I said with a weak smile. "We were both waiting." Ben smiled too. "Yeah, we were both stubborn." For the first time that afternoon, we laughed without feeling nervous. It felt like 2 old friends instead of 2 strangers. Then Ben reached into his backpack. "I've kept something for a very long time," he said. He carefully took out a small old notebook. The cover was worn and the corners were bent. He opened it slowly. Inside the first page, I saw my own handwriting. To Ben, let's stay friends forever. I stared at those words. I had written them when we were 16. I thought he had forgotten all about those days. But he had carried that notebook through every move, every difficult year, and every new beginning. At that moment, I realized something that broke my heart. Maybe I wasn't the only one who had been missing an old friend. I looked at the old notebook for a long time. The pages had turned yellow. The cover was worn and scratched, but my handwriting was still there. To Ben, let's stay friends forever. I smiled, but my eyes began to fill with tears. I can't believe you still have this, I said. Ben gently closed the notebook. There were many days when I wanted to throw it away, he admitted, but every time I tried, I couldn't. It reminded me that someone once believed in me. His words stayed in my heart. When we were teenagers, I had written those words without thinking too much about them. I never imagined they would help someone years later. It's strange, I said. I thought you had forgotten me. Ben slowly shook his head. No, I never forgot. I just believed I had already lost the right to come back. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I finally said something I had hidden for years. I was angry. Ben quietly nodded. I know. I waited for your messages. I checked my phone almost every day. Later, I stopped checking. I told myself that our friendship was over. Ben looked down. I'm sorry. It was only 2 words. Simple, quiet. But they carried 20 years of regret. I realized that this was all I had wanted to hear. Not an excuse, not a perfect explanation, just the truth. I let out a long breath. I forgive you. Ben looked up in surprise. So easily? I smiled. No, it wasn't easy. It just took me 20 years. He laughed, and so did I. The weight between us disappeared. It felt as if someone had opened a window after a long winter. We ordered another cup of coffee. This time, we talked like our younger selves. We remembered our favorite teacher. We laughed about the basketball games we always lost. We even argued about which old rock band was better. Some things had changed. Many things had not. As the sun began to set, Ben looked at his watch. I should go, he said. My daughter is waiting for me. I smiled, and my dog will probably be angry if I'm late. We both stood up. Before leaving, Ben reached into his wallet. He carefully pulled out a small photo. It was old and faded. The corners were bent. In the picture, 2 16-year-old boys stood on a basketball court with their arms around each other. Both of us were smiling, as if life would never change. I've carried this with me for almost 20 years, Ben said. I stared at the picture. Then I looked at the man standing in front of me. Suddenly, I understood something I had never realized before. Sometimes the people we think have left us have been carrying us in their hearts all along. Ben carefully placed the old photo back into his wallet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The evening sun shone through the coffee shop window, covering the table with a warm golden light. It felt like the end of a very long day, or maybe the beginning of something new. Before we walked outside, Ben smiled at me. This time, he said, let's not lose each other again. I laughed. Deal. We exchanged our phone numbers. Then we checked them twice to make sure there were no mistakes. No more excuses, I said. No more disappearing, Ben replied. A week later, Ben invited me to his home for dinner. His daughter opened the door with a bright smile. You must be Alex, she said. My dad talks about you all the time. I looked at Ben. He smiled, looking a little embarrassed. I guess she knows all our old stories. During dinner, we laughed until our stomachs hurt. We remembered our school days. We told funny stories that only the two of us understood. His daughter listened with wide eyes. "You two really were trouble," she said. "We were," Ben answered, "and somehow we survived." As I drove home that night, I kept thinking about everything that had happened. For years, I believed I had lost one of the most important people in my life. I blamed him. I blamed time. I even blamed myself. But life is not always as simple as we think. Sometimes people disappear because they are fighting battles we cannot see. Sometimes silence does not mean someone has stopped caring. Sometimes it means they are doing everything they can just to keep moving forward. I wish I had understood that sooner. Maybe we would not have lost so many years. But then I realized something else. If we had met earlier, perhaps we would still have been carrying the same misunderstanding. Maybe we needed time to grow. Maybe we needed to become different people before we were ready to understand each other. Now, we don't talk every day. We both have busy lives. He has his family. I have my own responsibilities. But every Friday evening, one of us sends a simple message. "Coffee this weekend?" Most of the time, the answer is yes. And when it isn't, we always know there will be another chance. Looking back, I no longer remember the years we spent apart as clearly as I once did. Instead, I remember the afternoon when an ordinary coffee shop gave me something I thought I had lost forever. People often say that life never gives us a second chance. I don't believe that anymore. Sometimes life quietly brings the right person back when your heart is finally ready. And when that happens, don't waste another moment. Some goodbyes are not meant to be forever. Some friendships simply take the long way home. So let me ask you one question. Is there someone you thought you would never see again, but still hope life will bring back one day?